So again, we're here talking about the plan amendments. A little bit of the schedule. We are right now between our draft environmental impact statement and the final environmental impact statement, if you're familiar with the NEPA process and the planning process for BLM. We have gone through quite a bit of our process portions and really are looking at developing the final environmental impact statement as our next major milestone, which after that will come the records of decision that we're hoping to have out in the next 9 months at some point here. That's kind of an outside time frame. We're hoping to have it done sooner than that, but there are a lot of things that change the schedule at this time of the planning process. If you're familiar at all with our typical planning process, BLM right now is looking at planning 2.0, as we call it. We've gotten to the point where most of our land use plans to revise those is taking 8 years, and so that's a little bit too lengthy of a time frame, almost a decade to get through that process. And so our national office is looking at ways to streamline that. Our process here, we are amending 29 different land use plans between BLM and Forest Service, and surprisingly enough, we are still on track with a 2.5-year time frame process, which is amazing to me, given the scope and the nature of what we're doing. So in November, we released our draft environmental impact statement. That went out for 90 days for a public comment review. We did receive numerous public comments through that process. We also held a series of public meetings throughout the subregion. Our subregion includes part of southwestern Montana, the Dillon area. In February and June, we spent a lot of time internally, or we're still spending some time going through all of those public comments, analyzing those comments, figuring out how best to respond to those and how those affect what we step forward with as the proposed plan and the final environmental impact statement. We're nearing the end of that process, but we've still got a little bit of work to go on that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Between March and June, we're also developing the administrative draft proposed plan, which will be the proposed plan that goes out in the final environmental impact statement. That's a compilation of looking at all of the alternatives, primarily the two co-preferreds that we had identified in the draft, which was the state plan and the sub-regional plan for Idaho. And so we've looked at both of those alternatives. We've been compiling an administrative draft. It's still a little bit of a work in progress, but we are nearing the completion of that here in the next month. We should have that wrapped up. And so that will allow us to step more into our effects analysis piece, which is really the last piece of developing the final environmental impact statement. Between July and September, we're going to be going through a host of internal reviews. That includes regional management team reviews, cooperating agency reviews, BLM and Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service reviews of that environmental impact statement before it goes out to the public. So there's a number of different steps that we go through in that process. And then sometime between September and December, we're going to release the final environmental impact statement, and then 60 days after that, we'll be releasing the records of decision, as long as everything stays on track. Public comments, I just wanted to spend a little bit to briefly talk about our public comments. We did receive over 15,000 individual submissions for public comments. Most of those came via electronic mail, email to us, so we have a huge email box that we received a number of comments in. Many of those comments, and I know some folks don't like me couching them, but we call them form letters. They say the same thing and they have a different signature at the end. They're not different with regard to the content. And we received 4 different groups had sent in form letters that said essentially the same thing. I kind of like them because you can read one and you've read 8,000 letters, because there's not a difference there. Of the 15,000 we got about 300 comments, and I refer to them as unique comments. They're different. Each one is different. It may be a page. It may be 400 pages of comments that came to us. And those, we spend a lot more time with those letters because there's a lot more comments in those and they're unique. We have to go through and look at each one of those. Where the form letters, you still spend time to go through them, but once you've gotten all the comments out of one of the form letters, you don't have to look at the other 8,000. You just have to verify they're all identical, and then you've got that covered. We've grouped the comments, the comments that we've taken out of each of those letters into 33 different categories, everything ranging from process to science and analysis and proposed plan efforts and different decision pieces. And we take those and we essentially assign different groups internally with our sub-regional ID teams to go through and look at those comments. They're familiar with the document, what the intent is behind a lot of what we've written in the document and the decisions that we've stepped forward or the alternatives that we've stepped forward. That group goes through the comments, figures out, okay, is there's something here that we need to augment with what we've included in the draft as we move towards final? Are there some things that we didn't include that we need to include and roll into our analysis and our description? That has been done at the sub-regional level. Our sub-regional team has taken a look at all the comments that we received for the Idaho and Southwestern sub-region and has done a lot of the responses to that. Right now we're at the final stages of looking at those responses that we put together for our particular effort and looking across the state boundaries in the Great Basin region to make sure that we're consistent with what we're responding and how we're dealing with different comments. There are various regional comment groups that are getting together. Paul gets to go to Portland next week to enjoy one of those regional comment groups for a week to talk about science and sage grouse comments in particular. Again, he gets the heavy lift. It's a sage grouse EIS. 2,000 pages of document went out, and so it's not a big surprise that most of our comments are.
You can keep going.
Is this the hook?
No, I keep talking.
All right. I lost my train of thought. I'm done. So comments and questions. No. So we're finishing up with that, and we'll be refining that for consistency and looking at how that adjusts the proposed plan as we move forward with final EIS. Some of the plan components that we're looking at and working on the details behind a lot of this stuff, I'm not going to go into any details here because none of that is releasable for the public as of this point, but we are getting close to having more of the details in place so that we can move on to the next steps. We will be delineating sage grouse conservation areas and management zones. Similar to what you saw in Alternative E, the state plan, we are delineating both conservation areas and management zones. We will be incorporating sage grouse vegetation habitat management objectives. You guys are probably all familiar with the Connolly objectives and the guidelines. That's primarily what those objectives are based on, and those will help inform implementation level activities and desired conditions on the ground. We'll also have an adaptive management strategy and an anthropogenic disturbance cap. We'll be looking at setting up a mitigation board to look at projects and how mitigation would play into development of projects into the future based on the management categories. And then that mitigation board would develop a mitigation strategy that's a lot more specific to Idaho, but that fits in with the broader WAFO Management Zone 4, primarily here, although we've got a small piece of WAFO Management Zone 2 in the southeastern part of the state. We'll also be doing wildfire and invasive species assessments by field office. If you're familiar with the state plan, Alternative E, out of the draft, there were a lot of management actions that talked about doing a response analysis or response time analysis with regard to wildfire or water capacity analysis. At the same time, there was a national team working on what we call the wildfire and invasive species assessments, and when we started looking at the details of those, the wildfire and invasive species assessments are really to step down the water level that we've got at the subregion, look at field office by field office and say, hey, where are the most important places for sage grouse out there? What are our suppression tactics and activities on the ground? How can we augment those and make them more effective and efficient to retaining that habitat on the ground? Also looking at the invasive species, kind of similar questions. Where do we have some concerns with the spread of invasive species? How can we augment or fine-tune our management out there to eliminate or minimize the spread of those species? And then we'll have program direction for every program that we manage, whether that's lands and realty, whether that's fluid minerals, mining, some of those different activities on the ground. We'll have direction that links back to the management zones on the ground. So based on the management zone, there are certain restrictions or activities that you can do or not do or have to do in a certain way so that you're minimizing impacts to the species out there on the ground. Then we'll also have a monitoring component to make sure that we're measuring and doing what we need to effectiveness monitoring on the ground. The conservation areas and the management zones, I'll just go into a little bit more detail. Similar to what we've seen in Alternative E, the state plan with the conservation areas. Those set up broad areas across the state. We have actually 5 conservation areas in the subregion, 4 within the state, so it's the same conservation areas out of the state plan, but we have included West Montana as its own conservation area for the sake of adaptive management and mitigation. Uh-oh, I hit the wrong button, huh? Oh, you got to read the really small print now. See, this is where the video goes viral. Not doing good on sound, huh? Okay, now I can't go anywhere. I am tethered to the floor. So our conservation area is set up that broader scale to look at adaptive management and anthropogenic disturbance and what that means within those scales. The management zones are within those conservation areas, but also across the state. We have identified core, important, and general management zones very similar to what Alternative E had described. And those management zones are applicable to the program direction. So when you talk about activities and how activities would occur, there's a difference between how an activity would occur in core versus important versus general type habitat. And those management areas are set up. Core is really drawing a line around our most highest concern or highest value areas for sage grouse. Important are high value areas, but they also may have some concerns out there with regard to vegetation conditions or some additional impacts or structures, so to speak, that are already on the ground out there. They provide a buffer for those core areas so that we can have more restrictive management in the important than we do in general to help protect the core areas, but not as stringent or protective as we do in the core, which essentially what we're saying is the core areas, we don't want to lose any more core areas. We don't want to lose habitat or birds in those areas. Those are the areas we want to maintain our populations going forward, and maintaining those populations will be adequate to keep the birds off the list, essentially. We can keep those populations out there. The vegetation and habitat management objectives, and there's a couple other pieces that I'll talk about that they're kind of ubiquitous across all the alternatives, but they help set up kind of some baseline direction and guidance no matter what management area you're in. We look at vegetation management objectives. Those are the goals or the desired conditions you have on the ground, whether that's for fuels treatments or vegetation treatments, or whether that's for your livestock grazing, and how those things are done on the ground to meet or achieve those conditions. We also have what's referred to as required design features. You may be familiar more with these. We used to call them best management practices. And best management practices from the services perspective, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they looked at those as purely optional, although that's not really how they were interpreted from BLM and how they were stepped out on the ground. So we are requiring the use of best management practices. It's essentially what that is. And that gives the service more of the assurance and the certainty of implementation as we move forward to help in their evaluation and decision on listing the bird. Seasonal timing restrictions, again, this gets back to individual project activities, whether it's construction or activities, maintenance and ongoing activities on the ground. When do you want those out there? There are some times of the year or times of the day that you may not want to have some of those activities. And those seasonal timing restrictions, I know Don and Paul and Jason Pyron with Fish and Wildlife Service spent a lot of time digging through the science on a lot of the different activities that go on out there on the ground, and have put a very good, robust description together of where and when those would apply. And the same thing holds true with appropriate lek buffers. Again, this is to try and minimize impacts to areas that we know the birds are using, and to make sure that they can complete their biology out there on the ground. So having appropriate buffers for different activities on the ground is very useful and helps minimize and ameliorate those threats as we move forward. So that's common and consistent amongst all the alternatives, will be part of the final plan. The adaptive management strategy, the anthropogenic disturbance cap, just a couple words on this one. We will be having an adaptive management strategy. It's very similar to what you've seen in Alternative E. The description right now is to look at our core areas. Again, we want to maintain and keep the core areas intact and have those as kind of the line in the sand, so to speak. We don't want to lose any more core areas. The adaptive management strategy basically says, hey, if you lose some habitat or birds in those core areas at different levels, what we want to do is further protect those by taking more restrictive management that we already have in those core areas and applying it to the important as well. So making the important management areas even more restrictive to add more of a buffer or a protection around those core areas again. So that's the adaptive management strategy that we have in play right now. And that'll be part of the proposed plan as we go forward. We'll also be incorporating an anthropogenic disturbance cap. If you remember going through and talking about mitigation, one of the components that we had in the sub-regional alternative was a no net unmitigated loss component, which I'm a layman when it comes to it. I understand there's a lot of details around mitigation that I don't have a clue with. But when you say no net unmitigated loss, to me that means no more disturbance. You may have disturbance, but you're going to offset it somewhere else or minimize it. I know there's some timing and different things that come in there, and I know, Steve, you're laughing at me because I'm not trying to make light of it, but because I don't know all the details about that stuff. But to me, I almost interpret it as a 0% disturbance cap. You're not going to have additional impacts to your birds out there. Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't as accepting of that concept, and so they really wanted to see a hard and fast 3% disturbance cap. And so that's one of those things that we've been working with the service on at a much broader level, and have developed a cap to have in play as we go forward. So that'll be one of those pieces that will be part of the proposed plan that comes to us out of some of the other alternatives that we talked about, because neither of the two preferred alternatives in the draft had identified a disturbance cap, so to speak, but we had to identify that in several of the other alternatives as we move forward. So that'll be a piece that we'll have in the final environmental impact statement. And both of those are applied and measured by conservation area. So it's not across the entire state or the entire subregion. You're taking each conservation area, which again, we've carved the region into 5 different conservation areas, very similar to what you see in Alternative E in the draft. And that's where those disturbance cap and the adaptive management strategy are measured and applied to. So that sets kind of the scope and scale of those decisions. The mitigation board and strategy, this again is some work that's been done at the national level, working with Fish and Wildlife Service, and what do we need to see as far as mitigation, how does that play in? And a couple of the decisions that we'll be looking at is, as a result of the record of decision, we will be fostering or coordinating a statewide group with the state partners, federal partners, in what we call a board, and I know there was some direction in Alternative E with regard to the implementation task force, and right now we're kind of working through some of the details on how all that would play together and what does that mean and how does that step through. So there's a few more things that we need to kind of wrap into a corner on that one, and I don't have a lot of good final answers, but it was part of a concept that we've got, and how it really steps out is what we're still working on, kind of some of that implementation level. What does it really mean on the ground? Once that board is put together, the first task they have is to really sit down and come up with a statewide mitigation strategy that's consistent for the waffle management zone that we're in, primarily waffle management zone 4. So we'll be looking across the borders with Oregon and Nevada to make sure that whatever their states are putting together we're also consistent with. But we are very much pointing to the framework that Idaho has worked on, and I know there's a lot of folks in this room that have worked on the Idaho mitigation framework over the last several years, and that's will be one of the foundational pieces of that mitigation strategy as we go forward. So that's a key component of the plan as we go. The wildfire invasive species assessments, I talked a little bit about this. Those are really interdisciplinary evaluations at the field office level to look at opportunities for fuels management, fire management, how do we augment and improve what we're doing on the ground already, and how do we maintain and protect those areas that at the mapping scale, we've done a very broad brush look at where are important areas across the region and or the sub-region, and that's what we call core areas. When you really drill down in, not every acre of core area is the same. And so this is a step down to that to say, okay, now that you've got those broad delineations, look at them more specifically at the field office level. Where does it make sense? Where where do you have areas that are more of concern that you really want to protect? It's not necessarily all of the core everywhere, because that's a pretty big area to try and set up your prioritization for. But there are areas within core that are more important than other areas within core, and that's part of what the step-down assessments is trying to get at, to bring it down to that ground level so that we're not managing up here, we're managing where we need to at the site-specific level. The monitoring piece, the proposed plan will incorporate a monitoring strategy that includes monitoring at broad scale, which is basically regional or plan level scale, at mid scale, which is also plan level but somewhat a step down towards the site scale, and then at the fine or the site scale look, so that you're measuring things on the ground. The intent there is to have one set of indicators that would stretch across all three of those scales, so you're not doing a separate. If I go to the field and I monitor, I don't have to go out today, I'm doing broad scale monitoring, and tomorrow I'm doing fine scale monitoring. I can do the monitoring at the same when I go out there that will inform all three of those levels. So that's one of the pieces that's being further refined and looked at more of a national scale, because there's a lot of interest in having some reportables at a much broader scale than even our region or sub-regional plan scale. So that's how that's kind of tiered in. We will be utilizing the habitat assessment framework from Stiver, and so that'll be a component of a lot of our management actions as we go out and inform those management actions as we move forward. And then lastly, there are innumerable details that we're still working on. As you can see, this is kind of a high-level summary of what we're doing, and there's a lot of details that we're pulling together. We continue to coordinate with Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the state. In fact, we had a very large, very productive, very tiring meeting here several weeks ago where we really went down and had a lot of questions about the proposed plan. How do things fit together? How do we mesh them? What we found early on is that we looked at our two co-preferreds, and even though the state task force had built the state alternative and kind of followed a path, the interdisciplinary team with BLM, Forest Service, and a lot of the state sitting in at those tables had followed a similar path and came up with what I call very complementary decisions. What we found is that a lot of times when we looked at alternative D, the sub-regional alternative, it may have been more specific at the ground level, and then when we look at the same type of program for the state alternative, we found kind of the broader goals and objectives. And putting those together, you get a very complete, robust plan. Other times it was the exact opposite, where the state plan was very detailed, very site-specific, and then you would go to the sub-regional alternative and you would see those broad-scale goals and how they would fit and mesh together. So we locked Dustin and Dawn and Callie Younger in a room for 5 days and kind of hammered out a lot of different questions. And at that point we had the benefit of the task force had met at least one more time to answer a few of the questions or concerns that had come up as a result of public scoping and just some additional details. So we had the benefit of some additional work that the task force had put together. And so we really are a lot further down the road of having that final environmental impact statement or the final proposed plan put together. Like I said, there's a few more details that we still need to iron out, but we're really close at this point. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, Brent, as you mentioned here pretty clearly, where we've broken the field into the conservation zone, or conservation areas, the management zones, and we have the core, and then the less priority areas there. One of the concerns from up in our area, where we have a lot of very, very high quality habitat. You mentioned here that a lot of emphasis is going to be on maintaining those items in those core areas. Are we potentially going to end up in a situation where resources in those core areas will be we potentially would be in a situation where we would be be so highly restricted because of those areas that we would all be penalized and so we're having to do things in the past to manage that habitat and take good care of it. There's a lot of work to be pretty concerned about for those core areas and the users that and we might be making.
You know, there's two concerns I've heard around that. One is the local concern, and I'm not sure if that's what you're hitting. The other one that I've heard, and that's why we have the conservation area concept, is the fear that, hey, we've got good habitat in our backyard, and we've done a lot of work to keep it there. We don't want something that goes on in Pocatello or Owyhee County or some other place distant and far away from where we've done the work, that impacts down there now affect us because we're going to have to be more stringent in our own backyard. And that's why we've got the conservation area concept, is to really break the state into areas that are very similar with regard to their threats, very similar with regard to the birds and how the populations are affected by or reacting to those threats, so that we can localize those responses as appropriate. So if something happens down in the southeast corner of the state, it doesn't affect the northeast corner of the state, so to speak. So, and I'm not sure exactly if that answers your question that way.
That was a concern also a lot, but I think we mitigated a lot of that just by what you said, because we talking, through our local working group and just as individuals and things through the conservation area concept, we could pretty much get past that, or at least we hope that the powers that be would see the reason in that we weren't maybe in our area, we're going to be held accountable to something that was going south real rapidly down in Owyhee or something like that.
Right.
It was more the local concern, because we do have such a large amount of high quality habitat there. Are we going to, especially like, I deal a lot with the grazing aspect up there, and are we going to be held to such high standards that nobody else has to be held to, that we can't even function, and it basically paralyzes our abilities to be there at all. And a lot of that is because of some of the management that's already been in place through working with the BLM office that's been very proactive in that area and things already. And we just damn sure don't want to be in a situation where we have to be held accountable to something that no one else has to be, just because we have good habitat and we take good care of it.
Right. Yeah, no, and I understand that because it's a very valid concern out there, and that's one of the things when we start looking at a lot of the management, the delineation of management zones will add an additional layer of concern out there. I mean, if you're in a core area, yeah, the bar's going to be higher. And that's just going to be the nature of how that mapping effort takes place and how that sets up the foundation of what we're looking at. Because by delineating those areas, that helps us make the case with Fish and Wildlife Service that if we're going to protect those areas, that will be enough to keep the bird off the list, which is our overall goal. But as we start looking at individual management, that's where a lot of the site-specific, the buffers, the seasonal timing restrictions, the required design features, when you start looking at avenues to do activities out there, there are some very narrow exemptions for activities, even within core habitat. And if you meet those, you're still not saying, hey, we just want to go out and develop without consideration of how we minimize those impacts on the ground. And so that's where some of the other management actions kind of dovetail and play in to give you that complete package. To allow for that activity on the ground in some cases, without having undue impact for the species out there that would push us more towards more of a listing decision. Yeah, Wendy?
My question, I think, kind of dovetails with Dave's. Can you clarify the level at which that 3% disturbance cap applies? Is that over the management zone, or is that at the core level? Or?
There's still a few details that we're working out, but it would be within a conservation area. But it would focus more on the core and to a certain extent the important habitat. And like I said, there's still some things that we're figuring out exactly how that works in there. And so I don't have a final definitive answer on that, but it wouldn't be the general areas. We're not looking at the anthropogenic disturbance cap on general habitat, because that just doesn't make sense.
Steve?
Yeah, Steve?
When I read the plan, and I'm looking at the differences in the size of these three different areas, the core areas, the important, and the general. And there was tremendous variation in the size, depending whether you looked at alternative B, put out by the BLM biologists, I think, and then C, which was the BLM proposal. I may be wrong in E. And not only was there a huge difference in the size of those general areas, but there was also a drastic difference between the restrictions that applied in those different areas. So what's been done to sort of deal with this, what I see as a major conflicts?
Well, and this is where I put my planner hat on. And when you're doing an interdisciplinary team process with a bunch of biologists, and I don't mean to make light of biologists, because everybody in here has got some biology in your background. That's why you're here for Sage Grouse. It's interesting because I go back to our training. If we go back and all the way through school, our college training, we're always taught that there's one answer. And as a planner, I used to be a fisheries biologist, and you work for the one answer. As a planner, and in order to go through our process appropriately, you have to consider multiple answers, which is very foreign sometimes to how we think and how we get through. And so the range of alternatives that we put, and it's one of those things that I was on my soapbox for many days across the subregion, talking about the different mapping schemes. Because what had been stepped out from our policy guidance back in December of 2012, or was that 11? 2011. So we're going back a few years, was one map. And that was what we were to use for all of the alternatives. And that really paints us into a tough corner just right off the get-go. And it may be the right answer, it may not be the right answer. And so I really made the case across the Great Basin subregion that we really need to look at variations in what that map really is. And some of those variations come with management strings attached. You know, where are you going to put different things, or what management is associated with those different maps, so to speak. And when you look at our draft, over and above anybody else's draft out there, we have a very broad range of mapping allocations amongst those alternatives. And really the intent there was to help describe that there are differences in effects just on how you draw the lines on the ground, irrespective of necessarily the management that goes with those. And so that's one of the pieces of the NEPA planning process that I was trying to highlight on and help keep us out of court. Because if we come back with one map that's the same across every one of the alternatives, and then we have a decision that says we're going to designate that map, we no longer have a range of alternatives, and it's very hard to defend that in court. And so we developed a range around the map even. And I know there were some differences between the maps, some broad differences between the maps. And we've had a lot of discussions over the last 3-4 months, especially with the state, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and BLM around what is the map and how are we stepping that forward. And we've had some very heated arguments and some fun discussions back and forth about what that looks like and what's the reason, what's the rationale for inclusion or exclusion of different areas in whether it's core, important, or general habitat. And I think at this point I can't share that map out because it's not totally final at this point, not a public document. But I'm pleased with the map that we have, because I think it's been vetted a lot more than it would have been vetted any other way, and we've got a lot of rationale and very good support behind the delineations of that habitat as we go forward, rather than just having the one map there and then not having that rationale on our record.
So you dealt with the map, but you didn't deal with the fact that they had different sets of restrictions that applied to the different areas with the different alternatives. And another thing that concerned me was the management triggers to go with adaptive management, because there was a big difference there between when the triggers took place where they applied and the degree to which they applied. So what's been done with your review to sort of resolve?
You know, and it's a very similar answer to the map. And I'll try and be as specific as I can without being too vague, and I do apologize that I just have to be vague at this point because especially with this going out to the public, that's not something that I can say, yeah, this is definitively where we're at, because we're just not at that structure. But we've had a lot of robust discussions around the adaptive management strategy specifically too, and it's all been playing together with the map, because the adaptive management strategy and the map designations on the ground are almost part and parcel of the same decision. So you can't have a discussion on the map separate and apart from adaptive management and how that would play in. So we have been having a lot of, again, very robust discussions about why different things and different pieces on the map should be included or excluded for different types of management with regard to that program direction, in conjunction with how does that really play into the adaptive management strategy, how does that adaptive management strategy work in that regard, and really fine-tuning what are the triggers, what are those triggers based on, and we've built a very robust record, again, behind a lot of those triggers that we didn't have when the draft went on the street. And that, I think, is going to go a long ways to helping support the final decision that we come out when and if we do get litigated over this, because we built a lot of that rationale now.
What happens to the designation of core important general when a fire comes and alters the state of the habitat?
This,
Sagebrush recovers in an area that was burned.
Right.
Vice versa.
there's a, I don't want, it's a great question. It's a very good question, because we've wrestled with that specifically, and we have an approach that I think gets to that response. And you guys are probably all familiar with the key habitat map, right? And that's one of the constant pieces that we've been working with from day one, is we have guidance and direction to go identify priority and general habitat. And that has almost been separate and apart from the key habitat map, which is the habitat map that tracks all of that information that we update on a year-to-year basis. Where did the fires go? Where did we get recovery of habitat? And so at the onset of delineating those habitat categories, we tried to marry those up together. The problem we have in the planning in the NEPA realm is that ideally we would like to take the key habitat map and say, okay, that's our map. This is what we've got, and we can adjust it on a year-to-year basis as we go through for all those site-specific concerns on the ground. But once we do that and link it to allocation level decisions at the planning level, it becomes a plan amendment decision to change that map, which means you're 2 or 3 years out of changing the map, which is not where we want to be. We want to be responsive with that map to be able to have an update on a year-to-year basis that helps describe what the conditions are on the ground. So one that's real time, or as close to real time as we can get. So what we've done is set up the core important management zone, or core important general management zone, is somewhat of a fixed map for 5 years. That would be reviewed within a 5-year time frame, kind of on our plan evaluation time frame, and we would, in every 5 years, go back and look at the key habitat map. At the same time the key habitat map is being updated on a year-to-year basis, we do identify that the key habitat map is going to be, it helps set or further delineate where we want to go with fuels treatments or vegetation treatments on the ground based on how we've developed the key habitat map. So we've essentially set up a process, and I hope I'm not confusing you guys, because it is kind of confusing how it works together. But we've set up a process where we've got some allocation level management areas, core, important, and general. And core is our highest priority. We want to make sure that those areas stay intact. But within core, we've got a key habitat map that is kind of behind that. So yeah, once you decide, hey, we're going to go do some fuels treatments in a core area, you don't want to just say that's as far as we go. You want to take it to the next step and say, okay, where's the key habitat here? What's behind that map with regard to the vegetation, the conditions on the ground? And that's where the key habitat map comes in. So it will help focus where specifically on the ground those activities would occur, so that you're maximizing your dollars on the ground based on the habitats that you got. So it's really almost a two-pronged approach with both of those maps. We wanted to keep the key habitat maps separate and apart from a land use planning level decision so that we could update it every year and use it to help describe where on the ground activities would occur without making it that plan allocation level decision that would freeze it in time until we came back to do a NEPA process. So I'm not sure if that, does that answer your question, John? And
5 years, that's updated.
yeah, so I mean, essentially every 5 years, we would go back to the key habitat map and look at the key habitat map and say, okay, are our delineations of core, important, and general so far deviant from where we have conditions on the ground that we need to update the map? And if the answer is yes, then we would kick in a plan amendment to update the map. If the answer is no, there's some changes around the edges, but it's really not that big of a deal to bite off a 3-year process, we're going to keep it for another 5 years. But that gives that check periodically through that we link back to the real world conditions on the ground with that allocation level map. And if it makes sense that, yeah, we're managing for things that the habitat's not there anymore, then maybe we need to change that map.